Sarah's heart raced as she pulled into the driveway of her childhood home. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the familiar white picket fence. She glanced at the man sitting beside her, his deep brown eyes filled with warmth and kindness. His name was Marcus, and he had been her boyfriend for almost a year. Today, she was finally introducing him to her father. Marcus reached over and gently squeezed Sarah's hand. "It'll be okay," he said with a reassuring smile. She nodded, though her stomach was in knots. Her father, Richard, was a man of strong opinions. He was old-fashioned, and Sarah knew this meeting would be challenging. But she loved Marcus, and it was time to bring him into her world. As they walked up to the front door, it swung open, and Richard stood there with a broad smile. His eyes lit up when he saw his daughter, but as they landed on Marcus, the smile faltered, replaced by a look of surprise, and then something darker. "Hi, Dad," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light. "This is Marcus." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. He forced a smile, but the tension was palpable. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand. Marcus shook it firmly. "Nice to meet you too, Mr. Turner." Richard motioned them inside, and they settled in the living room. Sarah noticed the way her father's eyes kept darting towards Marcus, assessing him. The conversation started politely enough, but it wasn't long before Richard's true feelings began to surface. "So, Marcus," Richard began, his tone casual but with an edge, "where are you from?" Marcus smiled, unaware of the trap in the question. "I'm originally from Chicago, moved here for work a few years ago." Richard nodded slowly. "Chicago, huh? I hear it's a rough place." Sarah stiffened. She knew where this was heading. "Dad," she began, but Richard cut her off. "And what exactly do you do, Marcus?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. "I work in finance, Mr. Turner," Marcus replied, still calm. "I'm an investment analyst." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Finance, huh? That's impressive. And what do your parents do?" Marcus hesitated, sensing the hostility. "My mother is a teacher, and my father is a retired police officer." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Interesting. And how do they feel about you dating my daughter?" Sarah felt her heart drop. "Dad, please," she said, her voice strained. But Richard ignored her. His gaze was fixed on Marcus, who met his stare with quiet dignity. "They're happy for us," Marcus said simply. "They just want me to be with someone who makes me happy. And Sarah does." Richard's expression hardened. "Well, I'm not so sure about this. Sarah, you know our family has certain expectations." Sarah felt a rush of anger and shame. "Expectations? What does that even mean?" "You know what I mean," Richard snapped. "This isn't what I imagined for you." Marcus remained silent, his face composed but hurt flickering in his eyes. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dad, Marcus is a good man. He's kind, smart, and he treats me with respect. That's all that should matter." Richard shook his head. "You don't understand, Sarah. This is about more than just you. Our family, our reputation—" "Stop," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking. "This isn't about reputation or expectations. This is about love. And if you can't see that, then maybe you need to take a good, hard look at yourself." The room fell silent. Richard stared at his daughter, stunned by her outburst. Marcus gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured. "Let's give your dad some time." But Sarah wasn't done. "No, Marcus. He needs to hear this." She turned back to her father. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, to be kind and fair. But you're not being fair right now. You're letting your prejudice cloud your judgment." Richard's face reddened. "Prejudice? How dare you accuse me of that?" "Because it's true," Sarah shot back. "You don't even know Marcus, but you've already decided he's not good enough because of the color of his skin. That's wrong, Dad. It's wrong, and it's not who I thought you were." Richard opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. The young man was calm, composed, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet strength and a deep care for his daughter. "I just want what's best for you," Richard finally said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I know, Dad," Sarah replied, her tone gentler. "And so do I. Marcus is what's best for me. I love him. I need you to try to understand that." Richard sat there, grappling with his emotions. He had always seen himself as a good man, a fair man, but now he was confronted with a side of himself that he wasn't proud of. His daughter's words stung because they were true. He had judged Marcus unfairly, and in doing so, he had hurt the person he loved most in the world. "Marcus," Richard said after a long silence, "I'm sorry. I let my old ways of thinking get in the way of seeing what's really important." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I appreciate that, Mr. Turner. All I want is for you to see me for who I am, not for what I look like." Richard sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his own shortcomings. "You're right, I was wrong. Sarah deserves to be happy, and if you make her happy, then that's all that should matter." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She walked over to her father and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad. That means so much to me." Richard hugged her back, feeling a mixture of guilt and hope. He looked over her shoulder at Marcus, who was watching them with a quiet smile. "I'll try to do better," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." And in that moment, something shifted. The walls that Richard had built around his heart began to crumble, and for the first time he saw Marcus not as an outsider, but as a man who loved his daughter, a man who was worthy of that love. The three of them sat down together, and as the conversation flowed, the tension eased. Richard found himself laughing at Marcus's jokes, impressed by his knowledge and his kindness. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but for the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope that he could change, that he could be the man his daughter believed him to be. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah looked at her father and then at Marcus, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. This was just the beginning, but it was a good start, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Richard worked hard to confront his biases. He read books, attended discussions, and engaged in difficult conversations with friends who had more progressive views. It wasn't easy. Change rarely is, but he was determined to become a better person, for his daughter's sake and for his own. Sarah and Marcus continued to see Richard regularly, and each visit was more comfortable than the last. Richard began to appreciate Marcus's sense of humor, his intelligence, and most importantly, the love and respect he showed Sarah. Slowly, Marcus became less of an outsider and more of a family member. One Saturday afternoon, Richard invited Marcus and Sarah over for a barbecue. It was a warm, sunny day, perfect for grilling in the backyard. As they sat around the table, enjoying the food and the laughter, Richard realized how much had changed. He looked at Sarah, who was glowing with happiness, and then at Marcus, who was engaging him in a friendly debate about sports. Richard found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation, free from the prejudices that had once clouded his judgment. As the evening went on, Richard excused himself to grab something from the kitchen. When he returned, he found Marcus standing alone by the grill, flipping the last of the burgers. Richard walked over, clearing his throat. "Marcus," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what he was about to say. "I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I want to thank you for being patient with me, for giving me the chance to understand." Marcus looked up, surprised by the sincerity in Richard's tone. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Turner. I know it's been tough, but I appreciate how hard you've tried. It means a lot to both Sarah and me." Richard nodded, feeling a wave of emotion swell up inside him. "You make my daughter very happy, and that's all I ever wanted for her. I'm sorry for the way I acted when we first met. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you. That means a lot." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the last remnants of his old prejudices finally lift. "You're a good man, Marcus. I'm glad you're in Sarah's life, and I'm glad you're part of our family now." Marcus was touched, and for a moment he was lost for words. Then he extended his hand, and Richard shook it. But this time, it wasn't just a formality. It was a true gesture of acceptance. As they returned to the table, Sarah saw the warmth between the two men. She was proud and relieved. She knew this journey hadn't been easy for her father, but seeing him change filled her with hope. The rest of the evening was filled with stories, laughter, and connection. When it was time to leave, Richard hugged his daughter. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You helped me see the world differently. I'm grateful for that." Sarah hugged him back. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. Thank you for accepting Marcus and for being open to change." Richard smiled as he watched them drive away, feeling at peace. The journey had been hard but worth it. He had faced his prejudices and opened his heart to a new life, where love and understanding mattered more than fear and ignorance.